friends. She happens to be a very powerful person, but she's rather pint-sized. We say she's distilled down to the essence. Very strong-willed woman, and she went into a period of seclusion and became very obsessed with the question of why did God make the world the way He made it. And when she came out of seclusion, she had a chance to walk up to Swami, and she sort of folded her arms and said to him, "Why?" Like that, in essence. Why are things the way they are? And his response was perfect. He said, "What difference would it make if you knew?" He said, "The problem you have is still the same, isn't it? Which is what? Your restless mind, too many projects, fear, timidity, too much concern for the past, anxiety for the future. The problem is all exactly the same. And we think sometimes that if we just had this answer or that answer, but mostly, and this is part of it, the only way those answers come is if we shift our own consciousness enough so that we can perceive the answer." That was Swami Vivekananda's answer when he was asked, why is creation the way it is? Why did God do what He did? And Vivekananda said, the level of consciousness that asks the question is not capable of understanding the answer, which I thought was a great trick answer. I thought that was terrific. But it really is true that someone asked Swami Kriyananda once, what is the secret of overcoming doubt? And Swami answered, peace, which was an interesting answer that I've actually meditated on a lot, because you think the answer to overcoming doubt is more information, don't you? More knowledge, more knowing. But it's actually an experience of a different level. And so one of the things that we're caught in is that we don't have that experience because we're running in circles. We're worrying about this, and we can't stop worrying until we shift. And so that's why we come like this. There's a power in breaking the ties, as I was saying, with your normal life. And also, some of us know each other. But, there's a large group of people here who are meeting for the first time. But what unites us now is not our professional associations or our familial relationships or even our shared interests in a broader sense. I know many of your backgrounds, and we're all different kinds of people here. We're different countries and also different inclinations. But what really unites us is our shared aspiration and our shared ideals. I've been living in spiritual community since I was 24, and I've been integrally involved in starting two solidly successful communities. And it's fascinating to me what true friendship really consists of. I realized this first when I was speaking on Wednesday night, and some of you were there. I was talking about a woman that I detested, and she detested me, and we didn't get along at all. And one day I realized she was one of my best friends. It seems paradoxical, doesn't it? But I realized that the only place we didn't get along was in our personalities and in certain karmic experiences we'd had in previous lives that we both remembered too well. But what united us and made us really best friends was our shared idealism. So the question also becomes like, who are we? What really defines us? And this is what a number of you have hinted at just in asking this question about how do we get back to our own peace. The question is, who are we? And what really defines us? And that is the thread that actually also weaves us all together. And the experience of the communities that I've lived in is very unusual. I wish it were not unusual. I wish we had these communities all over the world, and I hope, God willing, before too long we will. Because when people of like mind, not in an external way, but in an idealistic way, come together, it not only makes for a very pleasant life, but it also enormously amplifies every individual's capacity to focus and to lift their energy. And that's what we're also doing for each other here tonight. We're just being together with shared aspiration, and that vibration itself will really help move everyone. And what we're all looking for is that piece of us that is not defined by all of the ways that the world compels us. I mean, the practice of meditation, which we're working with, the practice of meditation is to remove that which you're not. And then you discover what you are. There's a traditional story that's told when a man carved out of a huge piece of stone a beautiful picture of an elephant, and someone exclaimed about his great piece of art, "How did you do this?" He said, "Well, I just looked at the stone and I took away everything that didn't look like an elephant." Very simple. So we look at ourselves, and we have many different ways of describing ourselves. Now, I would not just talk about an elephant exactly, but there is an everlasting part of ourselves. And when I was 10 years old, small as I was and inexperienced on this planet at the age of 10, inexperienced in this body and with that family and so on. But nonetheless, I was deeply conscious of some part of me that was entirely independent of that whole experience. In fact, one of my earliest childhood memories was my mother scolding me in the car. I think my sister wasn't born, so I must have been just 2, maybe like that. I was a very small person, because I remember curling up on the floor of the car. We didn't have car seats then. And I was tiny enough to fit very comfortably on half of the floor in the back seat. My brother, who was quite the tormentor, in a pleasant way. He wasn't really a bad tormentor, but in a pleasant way. So he undoubtedly provoked me, but then I got scolded. I say that righteously even now. But my mother scolded me, and I was tender-hearted. It hurt my feelings. The fact that she was justified didn't really matter. I just had my feelings hurt. And I remember sitting there and I had such an aversion to suffering. I just really did not want to suffer. And I don't mean that I had a rebellion against suffering. You see, that's different. To rebel against suffering is to demand that things be different than they are. And nobody mentioned that, but that's one of the main things that keeps us from a state of inner peace. And in fact, a great deal of what you all were saying was that we are rebelling against the way things are. On Sunday morning, we have a little ritual that we do. It's called the Festival of Light. And in the Festival of Light, there's an allegory of this little bird, and the little bird sort of setting off on its journey represents the soul. And it's a beautiful allegory. In the Ananda world, we perform the ritual and have the blessing ceremony every week. But the little bird goes through certain stages, and the first stage of its journey is it's a manifestation of the infinite, and its job is to be a loving instrument of divine light and love. Why not? I mean, a lot of the qualities, caring, kindness, tender-heartedness, all of those qualities, who are we representing? Where does that come from? There's this instinctive realization of our interconnectedness, isn't there? And there's this instinctive understanding that what I really want to be is more connected and more an instrument, because we get somewhere that we are what flows through us. And so when what flows through us is worry or fear or self-concern or resentment against things that have happened and too much concentration on the past, all the various things that have been said, we don't feel as we know we should feel. So this bird in this allegory sets out on its journey, and he's commissioned by the infinite to be a carrier of that quality. But then he gets engaged in his own little world. He starts enjoying his own personal power. He starts having likes and dislikes. He starts thinking that you should treat me differently. After all, don't you know who I am? You know, how dare you treat me like that? And we just start building up this whole story of how things are supposed to be. And in the allegory, it says we had this great infinite mission, but instead we rebelled against it. And we started hoarding and keeping and wanting things a certain way. And we actually enter this stage of human life called the revolt. And really, if one is honest with oneself and looks carefully enough, a great deal of our suffering, I dare say all our suffering, is because this is reality and we want it to be different. Just as simple as that. And we spend really quite an extraordinary amount of time just kind of standing there trying to make it be different. I shared with some of you recently, there was a little boy, very strong-willed little boy. He lived in an ashram house that we had, big mansion in San Francisco we were renting then. And it had this big staircase up all 5 stories. 2 in the morning, this little child crawls out of bed. He had just had it. He was wide awake and he wanted more going on than was going on. He walked to the middle of that staircase and in his biggest voice said, "I want it to be morning." He just declared it like that. Woke up the whole house, you know. It just... But how different are we really? I want him to love me. I want her to love me. I want to have this great job, but I don't really want to have to do all the work that's involved. I want my bosses to be different. I want my life to be simpler. I want my consciousness to be different. We're not saying I want to do the things that will make it different. I just want it to be different. And that inability to actually perceive what is and then recognize what's required for us to adjust to it. And I don't mean to compromise with it or to surrender to it in a negative way, but we never get anywhere as long as we just are in a state of rebellion. Think how much energy we use like that. I mean, I've watched myself many, many times and I finally realized I want it to be morning, and it just isn't. It's midnight. And I don't really want to live the hours, the dark hours, until the dawn comes. I just want it to be morning. And so much energy just goes into demanding that it be morning. Well, I was going back to my little child in the car, and I just really didn't want to suffer. And what I remembered, and this is where, of course, in retrospect, reincarnation comes in, because even if a child is small, the full consciousness and the full intelligence is present. There's just no language, there's no ability to communicate in the ways that we normally communicate, but that doesn't mean that the whole being isn't there. So of course many children have very expanded experiences, they just can't articulate them, and only later can they articulate them. But I remembered that suffering was only on the surface of my consciousness. That was, I mean, somehow even in my little tiny brain I knew that suffering was on the surface, and that there was a river underneath that surface that was always the same and was untouched. It was a very profound thought. But I lay down in the back seat of the car and I tunneled into my own self. I tunneled in until I got to the place where the fact that my tender heart had been hurt by my mother righteously scolding me what didn't exist anymore. And it wasn't like, and let me phrase it differently, it wasn't like it wasn't still there, it was that I had just expanded my reality so that it no longer defined me. And a lot of what you all are talking about, I mean what we're all talking about here, the conditions of our lives, 4 children and an elderly mother, you don't really want to have one less child or not have your mother with you. I remember a woman who had five daughters, and at one point she was so tired, and the children came rather quickly. She was lying on the couch and she was thinking one of them just has to go. There are just too many of them. Of course she didn't mean it, but she almost meant it. One of them just has to go. right? Because it's not likely that the circumstances, I mean, some of us, Claire specifically, is talking about really creating a new direction, and lots of us, it's not like it's impossible. But it's not like we can really make things different than they are. So a lot of what we have to begin to understand is, why am I in rebellion? What do I hope to accomplish here? This is the song that Dambara was singing at the beginning. If you're seeking freedom in a revolution, if you're seeking it in a fine palace, if you're seeking it in power over others, and all of these have a flaw, don't they? And if you have a bunch of children, you're just not going to be able to get rid of one of them. You're going to have to deal with all of them. And they just have a way of just growing up as they grow up, and there you have it. So, obviously, the only place to look is what do we have mastery over, or potential mastery over? The way we respond, isn't it so? That's the only thing in the whole system that is consistently something we have access to. And the mutability of our inner world is where the journey gets to be really fun. I mean, the infinite capacity to readjust our own inner consciousness is really what the whole story is all about. And just even the belief, even the smallest grain of belief that that's possible puts us on the right road. Because as soon as we're on that road, as soon as we begin to look in the right place for the right solution, that's 90% of it. It may still take us quite a long time to achieve it, but at least we're facing the right direction, and when we do get up our courage to walk, we'll be walking toward an actual goal. And what gives us the courage to follow that path is just little glimpses. There's Swami Kriyananda had a habit he traveled a huge amount, and he didn't read a lot of fiction, but sometimes when he was traveling, he would go to the bookstore. He was a writer himself, so he would always go to the bookstores, although he said, especially used bookstores where you saw hundreds and hundreds of unbought titles. He said it was very depressing when you were an author to see all those books there, but he would go and he would find a fiction book to read, but he would always open the end of the book first. And he would read the last few pages, which seemed like such a peculiar habit to me. And I asked him, why do you do that? And his answer was actually very touching. He said, I've had enough sadness in my life. I don't want to read a story that ends sadly. He said, I wanted to make sure it has a happy ending before I'm going to read it. And then I said, well, doesn't it spoil it? And he said, no, as a writer, I find it interesting to see how they're going to get from the beginning to the end. Now, I had a point to that, and I'll try to remember what it was. I guess I can't really, I think I was talking about the inner world being the only world that we can, yes, I know what I wanted to say. It's not like we can make our lives immune from challenge and sadness. And it's not like we're ever going to read the paper and not see 1,000 things in the paper to make us cry. Maybe you don't need to read the paper is something that we can think about, but that's the other side of it. It's just going to keep on that way. So either we just firmly decide, well, there's got to be another answer. See, that's where I came from. I was born that way. I've had a very pleasant life. And I actually even once asked Swami, why? I said, nothing has really ever happened to me. Why am I so intent about not suffering? And he said the obvious, well, in past lives you've had enough of it. But the difference that I noticed early on between myself and many others, I was willing to change myself. Because I was really serious about it, and I saw that it didn't work to expect them to be different. And the only way actually I've ever seen to affect them is to change me. We're like a big solar system, and if somebody's gravitational field shifts, then all the gravitational fields have to shift. And the only actual way you can affect them is when yours begins to change. And so that's what we're going to do together. We'll meditate, we'll hear music, we'll do yoga, we'll do energization exercises, we'll have wonderful meals, we'll talk together, we'll ask and answer questions, And each one of us, in just asking ourselves these little questions, what is the obstacle? How can I overcome it? But that's not going to be found by overanalyzing or controlling. It's going to be found by discovering that there's another vibration entirely that doesn't cancel this one, but puts this one in perspective. And that's what I was going to say about Swamiji. He's very tender-hearted. He was the most tender-hearted person I've ever known, because he understood more than most did the implications even of small actions. You know, what it meant for us going forward in our lives. But it was always in context. In fact, Swamiji said something once that was so touching. He said, when I see people who are particularly unhappy, he said, I always think about how much more joyful they would therefore be when they finally overcome it and realize that there's another reality entirely. Isn't that a sweet way to look at it? I was caught once. There was a very unfortunate death. Unfortunate from the point of view of the people who were left. And it was I had to go to the funeral, and it was a terrible funeral, just really, really painful. And I was not handling it well. And then I remembered, oh yeah, this is the kind of confrontation with reality that causes us to get more serious about our lives. And so, would I really not want people to have to face that? Would I really not want myself to have to face that? If this confrontation with reality is what stiffens my spine and forces me to think more deeply and more broadly, is this really a problem? I might not like it, but that's quite different. So, I think that's our story. That's our beginning. And then we'll just work with this internally and externally for the next 2 days that we're together. All right? Do you want to end with some music?
Sing a couple of songs. This first one is a song that Swami Kriyananda wrote for a wedding for a couple of friends, actually, called Life is a Dream. Life is a dream, time like a stream carries our burdens away. Never despair, joys everywhere. Love can befriend you today. Free from all care, like birds on the air, soar above griefs and worries, seek joy and be gay. Often on earth, things of great worth, worldly ambitions define. Sometimes a friend helps us ascend up from life's cares to the sky. Love is a star, though shining afar. It can guide us and help us toward light to draw nigh. Love is a star, though shining afar. It can guide us and help us toward light to draw nigh. But you don't get off that easily, because we're going to ask you to sing which you like on this last song, which is called Peace. It's kind of fun because it's all
one note. And the sing-along chorus is Amen, Amen, which you'll get the idea.
Peace gave us the mountains, peace gave us the sky. Nightly when starlight enfolds us, peace is its lullaby. Peace gave us the morning, peace gave us the sun, bird songs that call us to welcome day and fresh labors begun. Peace gave us the seasons, peace gave us the rain, cool clouds that gather to bless us, mist hands that soothe away pain. Peace gave us our heart's love, peace gave us our smiles, rays of God's presence within us, light